Hello, and welcome to the Enneagram in a Movie podcast. I'm Mario Sikora, and this is the place where my co-hosts TJ Dawe and TJ Ingrassia and I discuss movies through the lens of the Enneagram model of personality. If you like the show, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe, and join the conversation on our social media pages. For now, grab some popcorn, sit back, and enjoy the show. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Enneagram in a Movie podcast. I'm Mario Sikora. I'm here with the two TJs and with a special guest, our good friend Nhien Vuong, who is going to be with us. And we're going to talk about the 1993 Peter Weir film, Fearless, starring Jeff Bridges, Rosie, Perez, and Isabella Rossellini. So, Nhien, it's great to have you with us. Nhien, before we get started, do us a favor. Take a moment and tell our listener who you are.
Wow. Okay. Well, I'm founder of Evolving Enneagram. What we do is transform human ecosystems using this compassionate, contemplative approach to the Enneagram. So I both teach classes and do one-on-one coaching, etc. on it. Another thing about myself I want to say before we get started is I think if you think about different literacies, my Enneagram literacy is pretty high, but my movie literacy is fairly low. So I'll just start with that. So we'll see how this goes.
That's all right. That's all right. We'll geek out on the movie references, but Awesome. Don't worry about it. That's okay.
I'm exactly the opposite, Nhien. So together we'll average one normal person.
I'll increase my movie literacy through hanging out with you guys is my hope here. So
there you are. Yeah. Take notes because the references will fly. All right. So, Nhien, it's great to have you. So, Nhien is a good friend who has been, we've been interacting for a while through social media. I guess my first exposure to you, Nhien, was when you were on a panel, an IEA-sponsored panel, and I was impressed with what you had to say and reached out to you. And we've been having a bit of a dialogue ever since. So we're real thrilled to have you here. I think you'll make a good contribution, despite your
despite my spiritual background.
No.
It was the Enneagram and spirituality, by the way.
Well, there you go.
The IEA.
Yeah,
so.
That's right. And, look, this is why we picked you for this film, right? Because I think it's pretty easy to say there are a lot of spiritual themes in this movie. So what I was going to say is, despite your lack of broad encyclopedic film knowledge TJ Dawe and TJ Ingrassia have here. So with that, I'm going to jump in and talk about this movie. So Fearless, as I said, was directed by Peter Weir. Let me ask you guys, you guys Peter Weir fans?
I haven't seen a massive number of his movies. I mean, Gallipoli and Dead Poets Society, but I can't think of too many others.
Witness, The Truman Show, Master and Commander.
Okay, then yes, I'm a fan. I'm a fan without realizing it. Never really looked him up specifically.
All right, good. TJ Ingrassia, how about you?
Yeah, the same. I haven't seen Master and Commander, which I think we've talked about possibly discussing on this podcast at some point.
Well, watch that before you go on a boat ride, because I know you watched this before you're about to get on an airplane. So watch Master and Commander before you get on a ship next time.
All right, great. I will do. I'll keep a theme going. Yeah, I love Dead Poets Society. Truman Show's great, although I haven't seen that one in a long time. Yeah, like TJ said, I didn't realize I was a big fan, but I'm a big fan.
Yeah. So I'm a huge Peter Weir fan, going all the way back to Year of Living Dangerously with Mel Gibson and Linda Hunt. One of my early favorite movies. And it's the movie that kind of made Mel Gibson a star right around the time he was doing, I don't know if it was before or after Road Warrior. It would have been right around the same time. Witness, great movie. Mosquito Coast, not so great. So let me talk a little bit about the movie. Kind of a hard movie to summarize, I guess. So I'm going to give the outline of it. So Fearless opens with Max Klein, played by Jeff Bridges, a San Francisco architect emerging unharmed from a horrific plane crash in the cornfields outside Bakersfield, California, holding the hand of a young boy and a baby cradled in the other arm. Despite the chaos and tragedy all around him, Max is oddly composed. He hands over the boy to rescuers and finds the mother of the baby. Then he grabs a taxi and goes to the nearest hotel. He rents a car and starts driving home. On the way, he stops to see a former girlfriend, and in a diner, deliberately eats a strawberry, despite having a life-threatening allergy to the fruit. Rather than going directly home or even calling his family, Max checks into another hotel where he is discovered by the FBI. The airline arranges a train ride for Max to get home, but he wants to fly and requests a first-class ticket. On the plane, he is joined by Dr. Perlman, played by John Turturro, a psychologist working for the airline who specializes in PTSD. Once home, Max quickly grows frustrated with Perlman and the attorney Stephen Brillstein, who has been hired by the widow of his business partner Jeff, who was killed in the same crash. Max is dramatically different, being unusually direct to his family and others. He starts to think that he cannot be killed and has let go of all his fears of death. The next morning, Max is leaving his home. He encounters the young boy who he comforted as the plane crashed, and an army of reporters who start referring to him in the media as the Good Samaritan. The boy, Byron, credits Max with saving his life and says he only feels safe with Max. Max's relationship with his own son and his wife become increasingly tense. 3 months after the crash, Dr. Perlman asks Max to meet with Carla, a survivor on the flight who lost her 2-year-old son, who was wrenched from her arms on impact and died. Max and Carla develop a strangely intimate platonic relationship, and Max announces to his wife, "I have a feeling of overwhelming love for her. I've never felt anything like it." Eventually, Carla breaks down, and Max learns that she holds herself accountable for her son's death. To relieve her guilt, Max straps her into the back seat of his Volvo and instructs her to hold a toolbox the same way she held her son Bubbles, and he drives the car at high speed into a wall. The toolbox goes flying, and Carla realizes she is not to blame. While Max is hospitalized, Carla tells him that she has returned to life and that they need to end their relationship, but much to his disappointment, as he is not ready to go back to his former existence. Meanwhile, Laura discovers that rather than working, as she thought he was doing, Max has been doing a series of sketches related to the crash that progress from chaos and terror to spiritual equanimity, culminating with a photo of Bosch's ascent into the Empyrean. When Max finally leaves the hospital, his wife takes him home. He tells her, "I want you to save me." Brillstein shows up to announce that the insurance company will settle the suit the next day, and among the treats he brings to celebrate are strawberries. Max eats one and has an allergic reaction, and as Laura is trying to revive him, he relives the crash and is tempted to go toward the light, but her voice brings him back. He wakes in a state of crying, laughing, and as he and Laura embrace, he says, "I'm alive." So, general reactions to the movie, folks. Who wants to start?
I'll jump in. I have been a lifelong Jeff Bridges fan. I saw Tron when I was a little kid and absolutely loved it, and that movie continues to be a guilty pleasure to this day. And there was just something about Jeff Bridges in that movie that seemed so cool that just I was on his side from then on and still am. So when this movie came out, I was in college, saw the trailer, was super intrigued. And then when I saw the movie, I didn't really love it. Haven't seen it since, haven't thought about it since. Watching it this time, it hit me in the heart and had me in tears both times I was watching it in preparation for this recording. I think it's amazing. I think it's also interesting. I don't know that I can actually name another movie where this is the case off the top of my head, where there's a main character you can't really relate to. You're seeing the world through his eyes, but you're not. He's mysterious to the viewer, just as he's mysterious to the people in his family and the other people in the movie. So I'm eager to tease apart the significance of that, as well as other things.
It's interesting, TJ, that you mentioned that last piece about having a protagonist, essentially a main character that you couldn't relate to. That's what I actually struggled with this film, because I generally struggle with films if I can't find one person that I really like. And in his case, the lack of relatability has to do with something that I realized, oh my God, we talked about Enneagram 9s, where there's something, if there's a lack of directness in someone, I can't connect with them in a way where I can't then relate to their story. So it's just interesting that you mentioned that. So I struggled in that bit. The themes were really fascinating, but there's something about the distance in the main character's being that was really hard for me to connect with and then so stay with. Like do I care about him? And do I, and I have to admit, also, I might have some judgments around people who check out as well. that got really triggered, in watching this film. So that was my first reaction. And yes, also kind of seeing it was just such an original, like an interesting film that held my interest. Like, what is this journey about, right? So that held my interest, but I was really struggling to connect with the character. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I'm still processing what this movie means and what it's all about. More than anything else we've talked about, I really struggled just even with Enneagrammatic themes in general. I think because so much of what we're seeing in this film is people dealing with extreme trauma. Surviving a plane crash is about as intense as it's going to get. And so seeing somebody who's under such duress, basically, and processing all that, I think can obscure, it can make it hard to get a solid bead on Enneagram themes and that kind of stuff. So I've sort of been struggling with that, similar to what you guys have talked about. So I'm interested to have you guys tell me all the answers.
Or joining your struggle.
So let me share my reaction to the movie in general. So it's interesting, TJ Dawe, when you talked about watching the movie and being a little bit underwhelmed by it when you first saw it. I remember seeing the movie in the theater very specifically, and being a conscious Peter Weir fan at the time, was really looking forward to this movie, right? And so I watched it, and my initial reaction, in some ways I still have, is this is not a movie that has a logic to it. It is an experience, right? It is not something it's not a typical plot-driven or action-driven film. It is an emotion-driven film in many ways, even though the character is detached, like you were saying, Nhien. There were these moments of real connection that he was experiencing, right? The way he was connecting to some people in some situations was amazing, right? And at the same time, he was drawing more distant from the people in his life, right, in his prior life. So I loved this movie. It's a hard movie to watch. There are some movies that are tough to rewatch, right? I think of $1 Million Baby, for example, right? Rewatch, great movie. Rewatching it is really tough. United 93, another plane crash movie, right, is another one. Amazing movie, but I've only seen it once because I just can't bring myself to experience that again, right? With this one, the reason I wanted to talk about this movie on this podcast is because I think this movie is all about the inner triangle of the Enneagram. I think it's all about what does it really mean to change, and what are some of the ways in which we can change. I remember one time talking to a psychologist who said to me, people change in two ways, through acute emotional trauma and through hard work over time. And sometimes there's a little bit of both. Right. Another way to think about this is that people can change through what is called state work, right? You have an emotional experience, or maybe a drug-induced experience or something that has this change effect on you. But what I find is that people usually kind of go 2 steps forward, 1 step back in those sort of situations if it's not combined with some sort of stage work, meaning doing the hard work of change. Okay, incremental behavioral change. And I think one of the big themes of this movie was what can real lasting change be when it's based on trauma, right, in this sort of way? And how do we ensure, how do we, when we're impacted by something significant, right, how do we manage that change, and how can we integrate that change into our lives in some real way? Okay, so reactions to that. First of all, is that making any sense as I say it? I just said a lot of words.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting to see this main character as an avatar of that, because on the one hand, he changes into almost a Jesus figure. There's a fair bit of Jesus symbolism, sometimes quite blatantly in the movie.
Yes.
And at the same time, he's also reactive, and he slaps his, the John Turturro character. He suddenly will yell, he'll throw fits all of a sudden. He'll do erratic things. So it's like, okay, so it's not like this turned you into an enlightened master. Did it take you up the levels? Did it take you down? Did it take you simultaneously up and down? It is really interesting to look at.
I would suggest that this is similar to what people mean when they talk about a spiritual bypass, right? Where they have this sort of spiritual experience, but bypass the hard work of becoming a better, more virtuous person.
Yeah, I would say I'm glad you brought up that notion of spiritual bypass, because I think that's probably what triggered me around it, especially working within the realms of spirituality. I see that often, this way of checking out that has the semblance of like holier than thou, right? Like even some of the ways of showing up, the actions, but there's something to me, like spirituality includes a fully embodied humanity. And there's something in this where like he was so disconnected from his mortality for so much of this, right? That it didn't feel like the giving came from that real place. It's a different place to be like, I'm risking my life by running into this wall and I will do it anyway, versus, I'm invincible. And so let's run into this wall to teach you a little lesson and bring you and bring forth this very noble like purpose, right? And so yeah, there was something about that. But yet even within that, what's really interesting is normally you would think that spirituality, right, going toward the light, is being saved. And even as you stated in your summary, Mario, it was actually, in a way, his last statement to his wife, like, save me, is like, bring me back home to my humanity, is what it felt like, It's like that woo, it's like, it's bring me back home here. And so he is saved by coming fully back into his body. But yet, as you mentioned, with felt experiences of a different way of being that he could then bring forth into his life. So that's really interesting. But that was my big struggle with it, of like, oh, how many people have I seen like in that place where they're like, oh, well, we could do this. It was like, well, but it's very different. It's like, what's courage to me? It's not being fearless, right? Which is the title of the movie. It's actually having fear in a very like mortal way, and yet overcoming that fear.
I watched this movie last night with my wife for the second time. And she's a psychotherapist by trade. And after the scene where he crashes the car to teach her the lesson, she said, well, that's actually a pretty good therapeutic technique right there, because it worked. Nobody died. There is this tie between, he seems to have woken up to some, like, it's like he survived the crash and woke up in this alternate dimension or something, where he has access to these newer insights. He doesn't want to live like a coward anymore. He doesn't want to be ruled by fear anymore. But I think there's a big tie in humanity in general between genius and madness. Like, if you want the genius component, there's going to be some madness that goes along with it. And crashing your car into a wall to teach this woman a lesson it's effective because nobody died. But if she had died, it's like, well, that's not a very good way to live. Or, because he has a near panic attack in the lawyer's office, he runs up on the roof, and the only way he can calm himself down is to step up on the ledge and, with his overcoat covering his face, twirl around on the edge, inches from death. Eventually that kind of behavior is going to catch up with him. So it's like he's transcended in some ways, but also lost touch with his humanity, as you said, Nhien, in some ways.
And these are questions that are at the heart of spiritual work, right? It's how much of it involves uncovering something, original to us or deeper to us, and how much of it involves becoming. Okay? And so I want to steer in a moment, steer the conversation toward the inner triangle of the Enneagram, particularly related to the core qualities at each of those 3 points. Okay, others will refer to what I mean by the core qualities as essential aspects, and honestly, this movie exemplifies why I don't use that term. For one of the reasons. I also want to do a quick callback to TJ Dawes' point about Christian imagery in this movie. I mean, I think it was pretty clear. TJ Ingrassia already mentioned the scene where he's up on the rooftop, and there's that one scene where he's standing with his arms spread out, right? Also, after the crash, when he goes into the hotel and he takes a shower and he's looking at himself in the mirror, where is his one visible scar? Well, right where Jesus got the spear stuck, right? So there's this element of rebirth and resurrection certainly permeating this movie. Okay, so a lot of Christian themes. Any I missed? Any obvious Christian references here?
There's a couple that I found really subtle that I didn't notice till I watched the second time. The scene early in the movie when he's just sitting with his back leaned against his car. First of all, sitting in the desert is something that Jesus did. For 40 days. I mean, we don't know how long Max Klein is in the desert. But then he also gives this little spit into the sand and mixes it around with his fingers, which is something in the Gospels that Jesus did to cure a blind man. And he just holds that in his fingers. On the door of Carla's bedroom is a sticker that says, Jesus es mi mejor amigo. Jesus is my best friend. And later she refers to her friendship with Max as if God had sent her own personal angel. And then there's a scene in the encounter group at the hotel where one of the survivors talks about seeing Max and how he said, follow me into the light. I seem to remember somebody in the gospel saying that to somebody else at some point, you know. And then there's also, Jeff Bridges didn't have a beard. That might have been a little too obvious, but he did have long hair in that kind of handsome leading man way that was pretty normal in 1993. It wasn't quite a mullet, but it's not a million miles away from being Jesus symbolism.
But different from the long hair he had in The Big Lebowski.
Yes, very different.
All right. Okay, so before we get into the core qualities in the inner triangle, any good Enneagram-related portrayals that stood out for you guys, for any of you?
I'm very much in the same boat as TJ Ingrassia on this. As I was watching it, I'm trying to do my detective work of like, what type is Carla? What type is Laura, the Isabella Rossellini character? And couldn't really get that much of a beat on it. You know, Carla just seemed so racked with grief that that's her type. And we don't meet her at all before the tragedy. So she not only survived a plane crash, her almost two-year-old child died not quite in her arms, and she blamed herself. So she's at a very low level of health because she sustained so much trauma and guilt and blames herself. So I was completely unable to discern, like, what type could I name her as? I mean, I could give a couple of guesses, but I really couldn't back them up with much evidence. With Laura, the wife, my guess was a 6, but only maybe. You know, she was, when stressed, willing to argue, and argue hard and long, and including whether this is in private or at a friend's Thanksgiving dinner. Also, when the John Turturro character, the counselor, comes to her ballet class, she's a ballet teacher, she puts him on the spot and brings him into the dance, kind of co-ops him deliberately to make him uncomfortable. And I thought that could be a 6-ish way of like challenging authority, of like, oh, you come here and you think you can scare me, huh? All right, let's put you on the spot. How do you like that? And then when Max is checked out and he's up in his office and she's listening to music and she's trying to talk to him, but he's not responding. And eventually he asks her to turn the music down. She turns it up. And then she turns it up again in defiance. So thought maybe some 6-ish things there. But the only character, I mean, we've already talked about Max being a 9. That was the only one that seemed a pretty clean Enneagram portrayal to me.
I didn't think any of them were clean. I have to admit, Mario, when you sent the movie over to me, of course, you know, the bias of like you had planted the seed that Jeff Bridges plays a lot of 9s. So I was trying to shake that for as I was watching. I was like, okay, but don't assume, and look. And there were moments where it really felt unclear because of exactly the issue of trauma. And the issue of trauma going, one of the reasons I questioned the 9 is like in the plane, in the scene where he's talking to his business partner, and the partner turns and says something essentially like, oh, well, you're always like anxious or paranoid or something. I've never heard people say that of nines. Like if that's his default, so does he drop into nineness? Like, is that like the thing that he jumped into, right? If that's the default, like you don't hear it anywhere in the story that, like, for the most part, he wasn't present in his life beforehand. So that's where I struggled with the nineness, even though the character's energy throughout the film had that detached energy of nineness. Yeah.
So I think the probably the only real clear Enneagram characterization was the businessman who wanted to get back to work in the group therapy session, right? So probably a pretty clear 3. Thoughts on the John Turturro character of Dr. Perlman?
The scene when he first gets on the plane and he's talking to Max, the plane is pulling back from the gate and he says, "Oh, the plane's pulling back now. You should put your seatbelt on." There's like a banging noise at some point. He says, "Oh, that's normal." It felt like you would think that he was saying those things to comfort Max because Max was literally just in a plane crash. But it felt almost more like he was saying those things to comfort himself, like he's maybe afraid of flying or something. That scene felt maybe a little 6-ish. He's a little neurotic in that scene, but I had a hard time getting a beat on him through the rest of the film.
It's interesting because this movie was so much about traumatic circumstances. It's hard to pick out the Enneagram types. So anything we say is, subjective and speculative, right? I mean, this is one of those movies where, honestly, the Enneagram types are almost besides the point in comparison to the Enneagram themes that it focuses on, particularly around the inner triangle. I will say with the Jeff Bridges character, because there was that comment about, "Oh, you're such a worrier" on the plane, and it was a lot about overcoming fear. However, the thing I have experienced in working with lots of nines over the years is how much, once you scratch the surface, issues related to point 6 and point 3 are right there, right? In fact, and the same thing occurs with 3s and 6s. That inner triangle, I mean, almost every person I've ever worked with of those 3 types, at some point you get to a foundational set of issues. Number 1, I don't feel like I'm good enough. Number 2, I don't feel like I have value. Number 3, I don't feel like I have what it takes to survive. Okay, so fear, truthfulness, love, the capacity for love and to be lovable are really at the heart of all 3 of those types. Okay, so if I was to put a type on the Jeff Bridges character of Max, I would say kind of 9, just because his temperament and affect were just so 9-ish. And I have this Jeff Bridges is always a 9, kind of bias, right? I've never seen him play anything other than a 9 that I can think of. So I'd say probably a 9, but that's almost besides the point. Okay. So, TJ Dawe, do you have anything you would comment there before I go on to the next point I want to make?
Yeah, because I thought of those same things too. Like, if it could be a 6 in that as the plane is crashing, he has this transition from total anxiety to Zen calm, which is something many 6s describe when they're in a 911 situation if you push them to it. Most 6s won't think of themselves like, "Yes, I'm great in a crisis. You want to call on me?" They'll say the exact opposite. But if you really get them to think about it, they're like, "Well, I guess there was this one time," and then they'll tell a story of the time that they showed up brilliantly and all of their doubt and anxiety vanished in the moment, and they just went with their inner knowing and did the exact right thing. But then after the fact, the doubt returned, including the doubt about, should I have done that thing, even though in the moment it was right, and everybody would acknowledge that it was not only right, it was exactly what was needed. So the fact that he didn't revert to any kind of 6-ish anxiety, revisiting what had happened, but that he stayed in this kind of 9-ish place, led me to believe he's more of a 9 who just has a fear of flying, quite honestly.
Yeah, exactly.
Which many people do.
Right.
People of all types might be afraid of flying for any number of reasons. And then those bursts of erratic behavior throughout the bulk of the film, I saw as very much 6-ish anxiety and reactivity slipping in. And stressed out 9s can sometimes show that. All of this repressed fear, like Mario, as you said, it's in there. That's not what they lead with. You have to know a 9 pretty well to know that they have that, because they just seem like they're these calm, happy, pleasant people. But it's in there, and when they're stressed, sometimes it sneaks out. And it sneaks out all of a sudden, so that when he slaps the John Turturro character, he doesn't see it coming. We don't see it coming. Jeff Bridges' character himself probably didn't see it coming. It just happened.
He didn't hit him that hard, though.
Yeah, exactly. Or when he's driving with the lawyer and he just suddenly screams for no reason and scares the hell out of him, and then stops and says, "You're coaching me how to lie, and I don't want to do that." But like very impulsive all of a sudden, and that's why it's so jarring, because nobody expects it from him, including himself. So that's the way I saw like the 6-9 thing happening with him.
I also wondered about, I don't know the lingo because it's more like related to movies, but it's not exactly the term episodic, but is it possible that a movie that is created less to be plot driven, less likely to have characters that are, robust in that sense, right? Where they really do fit a character, because we're almost just getting pictures of humanity, like a kaleidoscope, and in that's what makes it sort of so hard to place. And like maybe it's not meant to be real characters. Like there are some shows that are deliberately like that, right? So I just wonder about that. Yeah.
So that's interesting, Nhien. I would suggest that you're absolutely right, but that points to it being a high-quality film that's actually capturing human nature in reality, right? Because humans are complex, right? I mean, in movies, it's easy to spot the stereotypical Enneagram portrayals, right? And when you read a lot of literature about the Enneagram, it tends to be pretty stereotypical, right? Based on these, characteristics. But as you get to know the Enneagram, you start to realize, wait a minute, people are a lot more complex. And we do see these patterns in people. But when we look at the whole of them, we start to see these other things happening that don't fit the simple narratives of what a 3 is like, or a 1 is like, or a 4. Right. So I think I agree with the point you're making. Okay. I think it actually points to that this is such a great depiction of humanity that it's hard to tell the type. Right. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I would say, well, possibly then a great depiction of transformation or transcendence, if that makes sense. Right. Because fixated humanity does tend to drop into that stereotype more. But when we're talking about transformation or something that lifts beyond into another aspect of our human potential, then we open up into the entire Enneagram.
If you want to find out more about my work with the Enneagram and organizations of all kinds, or our certification programs, visit me at mariossikora.com or follow me on social media.
Hi, I'm TJ Dawe, and I do one-on-one consulting on creative projects of all kinds, as well as Enneagram coaching. I teach an online course on how to create your own one-person show, and I speak at events and perform shows of my own. For more information, go to my website, www.tjdawe.ca.
This is TJ Ingrassia. To check out my YouTube series Typecast, which explores the Enneagram through film and television, go to youtube.com/typecast. And if you're interested in my professional video production services, check out tjingrassia.com.
So let's take this then a step further. And usually when we're talking about the Enneagram, from my perspective, we're talking about these 9 strategies, right? So if we say 3, 6, 9, striving to be peaceful, striving to be outstanding, striving to be secure. But there's this deeper dimension that's happening, right? And this deeper dimension we call core qualities, which are aspects of each one of us that, based on our Enneagram type, we just happen to have a little bit more of an issue with, or a sensitivity toward, right? So I, as an 8, have a bit more sensitivity to the core quality of point 8 of vitality, and TJ Dawe, as a 4, has more sensitivity to this idea of individuality and so forth, okay? So for me, the big themes of this movie are what is mature love? What is a real sense of value? A mature sense of value, and what is real confidence or will? Okay, and those again correlate to points 9, 3, and 6 on the Enneagram. And I think those were the key themes of this movie, right? What does it mean to love? Okay, what does it mean to have value? I mean, they were talking, one of the sub themes of the movie was, what is a life worth? right? And how do you get more money out of the insurance company based on the trauma or the nature of the death? And how do we get over our fears, right? How do we develop this confidence in our, that we can survive? Thoughts on those themes, guys?
For me, listening to you share, so we start with like love, all right, like benevolence, goodness at point 9. And it does sound like there's a journey through that when, there's an experience of complete like self-giving in his heroic acts of saving others. There's the moving into the notion of, I love this one woman, a virtual stranger, like I feel a love bigger than what I felt like my entire life before now. And there's the, I would even say almost like the self-love in the end that I felt that where his desire to be saved is a desire to kind of come home in a different way to himself into the world. And so for me, there's this interesting journey that you could maybe parallel around, like first this very self-centered egoic love that moves into almost a self-abandoning love, right? To love as an experience of oneness, and then love as an experience of self-differentiation in the highest point of the 9. Like I can kind of see that journey as one piece of it. Looking at fear, it's very similar in that, okay, what are the things that I'm worried about? And then him in the beginning, literally that statement that he repeats at the end, which is like, I'm about to die, kind of like, and it's like the facing of his mortality in a way that then buttresses him for life, right? First in a grandiose way, in the same way the love was a grandiose love, like all encompassing, so there was this way in which it was like far-fetched, but it was a way to sort of face something, like to face our death is to finally, if we overcome that fear, if we move through that, come back home into, like I'm going to be more alive now because I have faced my death. And I think that that's where he comes full circle to where it's very different from the spiritual bypass of, I can eat strawberries because I'm invincible, versus, actually I ate a strawberry and I survived, but the strawberry almost killed me. Like that's a different sort of facing of like that fear. And then maybe thinking out loud around value. I think you pointing out, I think it's a great insight to point out that like the whole thing legally is about like, it's almost like a legal valuing of our lives and how do we place a value on a person's life. And I think sort of the questions, it's almost like when he encounters the question with the lawyer, there's something about like his disdain for number one, putting financial value on it. Like there's like a distaste for that. But I think there's also a confusion around what it means. I mean, just like it's the entertaining of that question around what it means that I think he's exploring. And then I think even his comment, I don't know if you guys remember that scene where at first he's like resisting saying something to help, right? And then he's like, okay, I'll say it, kind of like, it's almost like this resignation to like, is that a way of saying, I'm going to honor its value? Like, I don't know what that means. I don't know what the money, but I'll honor that value. So I'm just kind of thinking out loud again about those three themes. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. TJ Dawe, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't have much to add. On the theme of love, there is a conversation between him and his wife when they're arguing where she says, I love you. We've lived together for 16 years. They've been great. And he says, not always. And she says, yes, always. They've always been great for me. Even when I hate you, I know I love you. And I was particularly impressed with that line. I thought that there's a very sophisticated take on what love is, what long-term love is. That when it's real, it's powerful, even in those moments of anger, even in arguments, even in bad periods. And she doesn't go into that, but like, how long does a fight last? How long does a dispute between a couple last? A day, a month, a year? And even then, there's this sustaining love beneath it. A moment that I found incredibly powerful, particularly the second time I watched it, was right near the end when he's come home from the hospital and he's just starting to realize that it's maybe time to re-engage with his family, he sees his son's scrapbook of all the newspaper clippings about himself. And we don't hear the voiceover. We don't see him or hear him say this to his wife or to anybody else, but we can see the wheels turning in terms of there is so much love between me and my son, and I've been neglecting him quite blatantly. And this isn't a love that I want to lose. And then there's also his relationship with Carla, in that when he drives that car into the brick wall, again, we don't know what's happening inside his head. The first time I saw it, I didn't know that was coming. I didn't know he was going to do that, just like she didn't know. We're meant not to know. One of the things we don't know is whether he's certain he's going to survive it. He's probably in that place of fearlessness where at one point earlier, he, after walking through traffic, he calls out to God, apparently, you want to kill me, but you can't. So maybe he thinks that I'm invincible. Or maybe he also thinks that if I die, okay, because this is worth it. And there's a line in the gospel where it says, greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. And that seemed a really interesting encapsulation of that, in that, well, for one thing, he was right. Carla was punishing herself to the point that in that point in the movie, she is so grief-stricken, all she can do is repeat the Hail Mary prayer again and again and again. When he moves her into the backseat, it's almost like he's moving a toddler. Like she's barely even cognizant. She's gone down to that place where basically nothing can reach her except something this extreme, and it works. And he lay everything on the line for her. And then he gets injured far more than she does. She recovers quite quickly. He's in the hospital for quite a while. He was right in doing this. It's an extreme thing. It's not something that I would advocate anybody do. It's not something that I think the movie is trying to tell us that if you really love someone, this is what you'll do for them. But it's yet another exploration of that theme of what does it mean to love another person? Especially because in the previous scene, he'd taken her to a shopping mall at Christmas, and he'd come up with the idea that let's buy presents for your dead son and for my dead father. And then he goes and buys all these sweet treats, like these chocolate-covered apples and the basket of strawberries and all these. And then they dance to Für Elise, as there's a grand piano and a pianist right there in the mall, and they spin in circles and circles. It's like all these things that I can do to reach you, to help you feel life again, to help you feel love again. So yeah, the movie was in many ways a meditation on that. And Nhien, to build on a point that you brought up earlier, one of the things I do is I teach a course on how to create a one-person show. And the lesson one that I always start with is there are 5 kinds of one-person shows. And this applies to more than just one-person shows. By far the most common is a story. It's a narrative, something that happens. Less common is a poem. And I think by your definition, this movie is a poem. Nobody speaks in poetic language, but it isn't a linear narrative. It is a linear narrative, although there's a number of flashbacks. It is about something that happens to a person, but it is more a meditation on or an exploration of a theme or any number of themes, sort of like the films of Terrence Malick or 2001: A Space Odyssey, where that's the majority of Hollywood films are not that. Hollywood films are almost always stories, and they succeed or fail in as much as they can get the audience invested in the suspense of what's going to happen and the resolution and of the climax and all of that. So this movie wasn't a massive box office hit.
It was a failure, in fact. They lost a lot of money. Yeah.
But it is a really interesting experience to watch and just let yourself explore this, almost like you're an undersea creature swimming in this ocean of all the many different flavors of love and of value and of confidence.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up Terrence Malick, because I think that is the closest analog to this movie, right? Because you're absolutely right. It is not a movie you watch for the story. It's a movie you watch for the experience. And if you're expecting a clear, simple narrative, if you're expecting conventional, then by all means, it's not going to happen, right? And Weir was good at that. I mean, Weir was good at, not giving you what you wanted as an audience member, but instead making you feel instead. So those are excellent points. We haven't talked enough about Carla, I think. Rosie Perez's performance in this was spectacular. I mean, she was nominated for Best Supporting Actress, I believe, didn't win, was fantastic. Her portrayal of grief was amazing. I couldn't imagine what it would have been like to go through this acting in this movie the way that she had to for a relatively inexperienced actor at the time. I don't know, tell me about the transformation of Carla after the crash. Did it feel believable to you guys?
It did to me. She needed a big push. And this is something that I've both been on the receiving end of and known of other therapists to recommend, is after a while, talk therapy can only take you so far. And sometimes when someone has a big experience, that can be the thing that breaks the story that a person is stuck in a cul-de-sac of. I've had a number of things like this, and I'm happy to share about it, even though they're not 100% legal, because I've talked about this on stage, but I have participated in a number of ceremonies involving entheogens, ayahuasca being one of them, where in some of these retreats, there's a lot of communal sharing before and after. So you get to understand where someone's coming from and how a perennial issue like an eating disorder or suicidal ideation or any number of things can just haunt a person so badly that there just seems to be no escape. And then this powerful, overwhelming experience can give them a perspective that they never would have considered, and that they feel it in their cells, and that even if it can't be proven, it can't be rationally justified, that part doesn't matter, because there's some part of me that's suddenly so overwhelmingly grateful for every moment of my life, including the trauma, that now informs who I am. And then, of course, Mario, as you were saying before, if you don't do something to integrate that, it's just going to fade. You're going to be living on this cloud for a little while, and then probably be subject to spiritual bypass. But then if you re-engage in the protracted and difficult and quite often slow work of integration, then that peak experience can inform your life and level you up just as a person and make you more loving and more compassionate, and most importantly, and this is particularly relevant to this story, more engaged in life, not removed from life and not dismissing life as none of this is actually real, but more like this is real, even though it's one small part of a much bigger whole, and it's not to be devalued because it's one small part, it's to be embraced because it's one small part. And all of these little elements of my life, whether they were my relationship with my wife or my kids or my work or the city around me or doing good works or just taking out the garbage, all of those things can be done with that much more joy and engagement and love.
Yeah, well, this harkens back to something one of the themes you opened us with, Mario, which is, to me, the difference almost between stages and states. And that, like, this notion that this visceral experience enabled her to experience a state of being that helped her to move into a different stage sort of her growth, if you will, like that notion. So to the extent that we believe that, like, even traumatic events, right, like describing this accident as something beyond, I mean, it felt like she was spitting in her head in guilt, and so in her body released that guilt for her in that moment, right? And so that kind of freed up, like, to be in a different stage of life. And whether or not, I think we're kind of beyond the, since, like, can we type these people or not, kind of, and to the extent that, like, we can't, maybe there's something just more symbolic in that journey around states and stages. But I have to say that there were moments where I'm like, shit, we've been talking about sixes a lot. I actually had this, like, well, okay, she's not an 8 because she didn't think she was strong enough. She appealed to authority, the stewardess, to help her. And then she was upset that the authority didn't give her the right instructions, and then she's in fear, and then she's in fear for her life in the car and needing the support of, like, his authority, if you will, kind of, and so I could see that as a spiraling thing. And even, like, some of the issues that sixes have around projecting power outside of themselves and then splitting and then feeling like I hold all the badness, if you will, and holding that, and something in that, I think, reintegrated her, and that's symbol. I think that was expressed in the fact that when Max's wife asked her to stay away from him, that she moved from sort of sometimes when sixes get into, like, I don't hold the power, to a sense of responsibility where she claimed responsibility. That felt like an act of claiming her power again. That was like evidence and of this different stage of being, if you will.
Yeah. Issues of locus of control are very central to sixes, right? How much control do I have over this? Am I a victim, or am I the one who's responsible for what happened? And I think that clearly plays out with Carla. I mean, her big concern was, it's my fault my baby died, and the cleansing for her was to realize that there was nothing she could have done. She felt kind of like a six-ish character to me. Right. Again, I wouldn't, bet the mortgage on that or anything, and I don't think that we could, but it felt six-ish for me, in the sense that the core issue she was struggling with was, do I have what it takes to survive? I mean, because remember, we first meet her when she can't get out of bed for 3 months. She just wants to die. She says, I just can't do this. And this is the core fear at point 6 is, I just can't do this, right? Life's too scary for me. It's too overwhelming. I don't have what it takes to survive. So big theme. And again, I think for me, what this movie highlights, again, it's not so much about depictions of Enneagram types, but it's depictions of phenomena, intrapersonal phenomena that the Enneagram depicts in us, right? This issue of, number one, what does it mean to change and to grow? Okay, and what is true growth, right? I mean, the movie was based on a novel that was written by an author who survived a car crash and said, noticed his own experiences of having survived a pretty significant car crash, and then started studying survivors of trauma like that and what they go through. And what they found was that their experiences were very similar to what was depicted in the film. I have this feeling of complete change, everything is different now. And then eventually they sort of normalize again, okay? But if they're lucky, it's not quite the same sort of normal, right? It's kind of like the hero's journey, right? Where the hero goes out there to experience the world and realize, well, wait a minute, what I was looking for was always right here, but it's a little bit different than I thought it was. Okay. Thoughts on that?
I'll say one thing there that I thought was interesting was that, TJ, you were talking about this sort of sacrificial love of him trying to help her see that it's not her fault. He's going to crash this car. He may or may not be thinking he's going to survive it or not. And after they survive, Carla goes to visit him at the rehab facility. And she basically, not exactly breaks up with him, but sort of says, like, I've come back to reality. You've helped me come back to reality. And now you need to come back to reality too. And if we stay together, continue this relationship, it's not going to help you come back. And then immediately the next scene is he goes home and he says to his wife, I want you to save me. So it's like he's saying, I just saved Carla. Now I'm realizing I need someone to save me in the same way, because I'm not going to get out of this if you don't help me out of it.
For me, that represents a recognition of the interdependence of love. Right? That love is not just about sacrifice. It's not just about receiving selfishly. It's about the interdependence that we all experience and how we need to both receive love and to give love to be fully human. Okay? Again, it also speaks to this idea of inherent worth versus earned, or I'll say inherent value versus earned worth. Okay, core issue for 3. The core quality of point 3 is that we are inherently valuable. We don't have to prove our value, we just are. But as we go out into the world and start to become socialized and we start to, kind of lose contact with that core quality, our value becomes dependent upon something else. Okay. And we're always wrestling with, well, so how can I recapture that feeling of value if it's determined by something else that's really, really arbitrary, right? As they were talking about putting a value on the people. Hey, if he suffered more, it would be worth more, kind of thing, right? If you could say, oh, you tried to commit suicide, so that means we're going to get more money, sort of thing, right? So it is, what is genuine worth to really like? and how do we integrate that? Go ahead, Nhien.
Actually, so as you were sharing about interdependence, I was just really touched. I mean, to hear you and both of the TJs share, it is striking how it's so, this conversation is so beyond the movie itself, but like what touched you is a window into you, you know, and so I have this cherished interdependence of Mario being dependent too, and I just.
I'm just talking about a movie here in the end. I'm not talking about me. I'm just talking about a movie. Come on, man. Yeah.
I'll be resharing this podcast with all of my, but it is true, right? Because that's what we're talking about. Like what is touching to each of us. Like I'm noticing what each of you notices and what you care about, and that's the beautiful piece of that. And it also, and it does it, and seeing it through your eyes, I was like, oh, it makes sense given that background perspective, why that would be extra special. Like given Mario might have leaned toward more self-reliance in his life, like just guessing, like I'm not. So let's just make it deeply personal, right?
Yeah. Well, this is going to lead us to the conversation about what it was. The movie had been better if the character was an 8, 1, 4, or 3. But we'll save that for a moment. So go ahead, Nhien. I interrupted.
No, that's essentially it. Oh, but it did. One of the things when I couldn't figure out like the types of everyone in the movie, that my next question was, wait, who wrote it? That's what I want to know, because is it the fearless isn't the question from the protagonist, but it's almost like someone distant from the protagonist trying to live out their issues of fear through the protagonist. That's what I was trying to discern. It's like, what is this, like a 7 looking at a 9? It's like, like those are the questions that were kind of behind the scenes happening for me here. Yeah.
Interesting. And those are something we've talked about very often, is how, because filmmaking is a collaborative process, you often have multiple influences on a character, right? And so it can be hard to tease out, okay, is this character a 9, but it's a 7 director and, and a 5 actor and, all these sort of things. So those are relevant points. So for me, I kind of threw us a curveball on this. I think I picked this movie, and I picked this movie with Nhien in mind, because I was intrigued with the themes and was intrigued in how she would come to this movie, and you have not disappointed, Nhien. And for me, again, it was almost Enneagram types were beside the point of this movie. It's more about what the Enneagram teaches us at a deeper level about fundamental human dynamics, which I think were very clear, vividly on display in this film. So before we get into our final, kind of lighthearted question of would this movie have been better if, any final thoughts on the movie?
It's just a quick one. I know that you mentioned it in the very beginning. It's the obvious theme of death and rebirth. But it did strike me that when, and I'm so bad with names, when Max was in the car with Carla, I believe, and they were driving together, I don't know, maybe to the mall at that point, and he says, they're not like us, like the rest of these people, like they didn't die. That theme of, St. Paul, I die daily, the theme common in many of the world's wisdom traditions around dying before you die, that felt really important as a spiritual journey that this whole film represented for me, to die symbolically before you die. Yeah.
Yes. It's the memento mori, right? It's the acknowledgement of the possibility of death, and the and not just the possibility, but the guarantee of death, right? And without this knowledge that we can die, we really can't live, right? So the practice of the memento mori, as you say, Nhien, is in a lot of traditions. I keep a skull up on the shelf across from my desk there for that very reason. It's this reminder of you will be dead soon, right? So focus, pay attention, live. And I think this is one of the themes. And in fact, he goes through this period of, thinking he cannot die, right? When he walks across the Embarcadero, for example, with all the cars coming in that scene, and he was, eating the strawberries. And because he doesn't believe he can't die, he's not really alive. He thinks he is, right? But he has this coldness to him that you've commented on. And it's not until the end of the movie when he eats the strawberry and almost dies, comes within a whisper of dying, that he finally feels alive again, right? Which was the interesting theme for me.
Yeah, I had the thought that there's one of the very last shots is him standing in that fuselage with sort of the light, and he's looking back like he's trying to decide, do I go on or do I come back? It's almost like metaphorically the entire film takes place with him standing on that fuselage in that place. And he's looking at the light. Through most of the film, he's looking towards that light, but he feels like he's alive, but he's not really alive the whole time. And it's not until the very end he comes back that he's alive again.
Yeah, one of the Enneagram virtues, which is something I've heard Russ Hudson talk about more than once. For 9, the virtue is engagement, which is a different word than Oscar Chazo chose for the 9, which was action. And Russ's take on that was you can be active and disengaged. Many people are. You can be a workaholic. You can be incredibly busy and doing all kinds of things, and your head is somewhere else. And that actually describes not just 9s, but a lot of us, a lot of the time, which is why we do the work with the Enneagram, is to break ourselves out of the perpetual sleepwalking that characterizes a lot of our waking lives. And particularly with 9s, but it's relevant to all of us, is to really engage. And just to build on what has been said, not this simulation of being engaged, but to really be here and now with myself, with the other people in my life, and with the world, which is that was the conclusion of it. And the final shot is he's fallen back. He's regained consciousness. He says, I'm alive. And he's in that state where it's actually a little unclear whether he's laughing or crying. It looks a little bit more like laughing, but laughing and crying at that extreme degree look pretty similar. But what I got out of that was just an embrace of life. And I would imagine what's going to happen to that character afterwards is that he would commit himself to his marriage, to his family, to his job, maybe even to helping out the kids of his deceased partner, and not being this guy with his head in the clouds, but being the guy who is here and now, for better or for worse.
Yeah, just to jump in really quickly. So Mario, for those of you who don't know, Mario and I first met in person in Cairo, Egypt in January of this year. My presentation in Egypt was on death and the Enneagram. And the whole idea, as a minister, like I walk people into this like journey, right? Where some people are actually facing this like in a very live, visceral way. And one of my first slides is a slide where like, yes, this is the Enneagram describes 9 versions of sleepwalking, right? The 9 takes it most seriously, like in a way, right? Makes it part of the persona. But there's that aspect to that sleepwalking. And the whole idea behind my presentation was that the confrontation, like that there are many ways we talk about death euphemistically, etc. But like that's very direct confrontation of like our mortality is what brings us to life in a way. And so I could see that in this movie, both like in that literal sense, but also even seeing like if we do think, Carla's a 6, that what she had to die to was different. That piece of like, if anything, it was like her powerlessness, like to kind of live into like the fullness of her wholeness, and her quote engaged self was a different version. And I think that's where it's enneagrammatic, right? Like what we need to die to, that we may live into our fullness, if you will.
Yeah. So great, thanks, Nhien. And so there are a couple of points I'll make here. So I talk about accelerators related to each of the 9 points, practices that help cultivate the core quality. At point 9, it is generativity, right? This idea of giving to others, helping others to grow without an expectation in return, right? And so this was clearly something that was on Max's path. At point 3, there's the identification of purpose, right? Why am I doing these things, right? What is it I'm trying to achieve in life to make the world better, to live my life? And in point 6, it's finding evidence, right? So I develop confidence by finding evidence of my capabilities. And clearly this is something we saw in Carla, right? I mean, it was kind of a science experiment that Max conducted on her in a, questionable way, but if it worked, so we'll give him a pass on that. Very, very Albert Ellis, TJ Ingrassia. You might want to ask your wife if she saw the Albert Ellis influences in that piece. Another thing, I think it was TJ Dawe mentioned the crying, laughing at the end. The Tibetan teacher Chogyam Trungpa, who founded Naropa Institute, talked about the state of sorrow-joy being the condition of life, right, where we experience both sorrow and joy at the same time. And true living is the ability to hold on to both of those things. So that he was, crying, laughing, both, one or the other, was sort of fitting with that idea. It seemed to me. That's what came to mind as I watched that. One final thing, when she was looking at his work, and it went from those drawings he did to the photo of the art by. Did you guys catch who the artist was of that?
Hieronymus Bosch.
Yes, and any other famous piece of Bosch's work come to mind here, TJ?
Well, he's got the is it the Garden of Earthly Delights? And then that's the main one, I think. Yeah, he seems like a pretty well-adjusted, normal kind of guy.
Yeah, well, go to the Prado in Spain sometimes, in Madrid, and see the Boscos, as they call them there. The guy had some things going on in his mind, but one of his most famous pieces was actually a depiction of the 7 deadly sins. It's this circular piece on the table of the 7 vices: anger, lust, gluttony, etc., which brings us all back to the Enneagram, because we all know the Enneagram is the 7 deadly sins plus 2. So it was a neat little tie-in there, I thought, when we saw the credit. So, okay, so final question. Would this movie have been better if the lead character, the Jeff Bridges character, was a 3, a 1, a 4, or an 8? Who wants to go first and focus on their Enneagram type?
I don't think it would have been that much different. I think a 4 who'd gone through that experience, let's say it's a 4 who's an architect with a wife and a son, would probably grow similarly withdrawn from them. Would probably be more likely to disappear into creative work, which Max does. He does a lot of drawings. So I can picture a 4 doing that, but also maybe wanting to create a masterpiece to capture the experience. Might want to change his career, so now he's simply a painter, or wants to create some building that represents his new vision of life. I can also picture the relationship between him and Carla leaning more into romantic feelings. I think unhealthy 4s, or just 4s, average traumatized 4s, like all kinds of 4s who aren't doing so well, can be attracted to someone who's suffering for all the wrong reasons. We can be brokenhearted together. We can be broken together. And my wife, who wasn't in this plane crash, just doesn't understand the real me anymore. Nobody does, but you do, because we've been through it together. And in fact, you've suffered even more than me because you lost a son. And it's interesting that the movie didn't go there at all. They even do kiss briefly, but it seems friendly.
Yes.
And I can imagine Hollywood studio executives wanting to have more of a romantic subplot, which there really wasn't. It wasn't about that. But I can picture what a 4 in that role probably would have been, and not for the benefit of the film or the themes.
TJ, if he was a 1.
Oh, God. I don't know. Maybe he would have had more survivor's guilt that he survived and didn't perish with everyone else. Maybe he would have led an investigation into the issues of the crash and make sure this never happens again. Maybe he would have had. It was interesting. I was thinking about how would I react if I was put in this position of potentially having to lie or stretch the truth around the nature of my partner's death to benefit his widow and their children. And, I like to tell the truth as much as possible, but you also want to help these people. And so maybe there'd be more there'd be more agonizing over that question than he's got, but probably wouldn't have worked so well if he was a 1.
Yeah, and if he was a 3, any thoughts?
Well, what's funny is we were talking earlier that it's hard to actually pick his Enneagram type, but we could probably eliminate 3 for his complete lack of interest in being the hero, if you will.
Yeah, interesting.
That he didn't play off of that at all. But I feel like the way it might have gone a little differently is, I imagine if that had happened and the person was a 3, and they're in the limelight, that the healing thing at the end would have been something along the lines of the wife being like we loved you before that, and that was like coming home to self, to understand like you didn't need to create that significance, or even the specialness of all the lights and the like all that, and so this healing of just landing in like the isness of being. So
landing, that's an ironic term to use.
Good, nice catch. So yeah,
that's great. It's a good insight, and in fact, this is one of the things I thought of with the character, particularly when he came out of his house and all the reporters were there and they're calling him a hero and the Good Samaritan. And what does he do? He runs away,
out,
right? So for me, that kind of self-deprecation was, again, kind of a 9-ish trait. If the character was an 8, there would have been a whole lot of, look, just suck it up, okay? You survived the crash, quit your whine and get back to work sort of thing. So, So, all right, good. So, guys, great episode and a real interesting conversation. Nhien, I want to thank you for being with us. I know that, again, you're not a huge movie person, and I appreciate you sitting through this movie not just once, but twice in order to be sufficiently prepared. And I knew you would make some really great contributions to the conversation. So thank you for that. I just want to remind people that, you can reach Nhien. Nhien, you have a website or something where people can reach you?
Yes, evolvingenneagram.com is my website. Right. Thanks, Mary.
All right, great. Again, Nhien caught my attention because when I was listening to her on this panel of the Enneagram and spirituality, I thought she was very thoughtful and insightful, and rather than just parroting, things she had heard or read in Enneagram books, I was impressed with her ability to actually think through things and come up with interesting insights. Again, we tend to downplay spirituality in our work with the Enneagram for, not because we have anything against it, but if you are interested in, kind of a more spiritual approach to the Enneagram, I highly recommend Nhien's work. So thank you, Nhien. So I guess with that, folks, we come to the end of another episode of the Enneagram in a Movie podcast. TJ, thank you again as always. And Nhien, it was great to have you with us. Thank you.
So great to be here.
All right. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Enneagram in a Movie podcast. Be sure to join us for the next exciting episode. In the meantime, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe, and join us on social media.